Okay, I'd like to maybe have a subtitle on here that says something about polarization position angle over 20 or 30 years. So that makes a little bit more difference. Okay, the motivation for this is that there's a lot of optical polarization in the literature, and we had a lot of our own as well. And I was wondering what to do with it, because this was stuff that was polarization sometimes that was taken for other purposes, or because the weather was bad and we had to look at bright sources, something like that. So I was wondering what to do with it. And then I realized that actually there's a possible opportunity, and that is that the University of Michigan has a radio monitoring program that also measures polarization. And so that I had an opportunity to compare the optical and radio polarization. So that was a sort of observational motivation. And some of these data go back 30 or 40 years, like to 1970, before some of you were even born. So the theoretical motivation, which I hope still exists actually, was partly the Ledlow-Owen diagram, suggesting that maybe accretion ratio had something to do with the division between FR1 and FR2 radio structure. And maybe this is still true, at least it has maybe a slightly different interpretation as a result of at least from my point of view, from attending this meeting. Okay, so one thing a couple of mechanisms that are important for what I'm going to say are two simple things. One is both optical depth effects, and one is the optically thick and optically thin synchrotron radiation, the optical depth being a function of frequency. And when you go to low frequencies, you can, if you go to optical depths greater than 1 or so, the position angle can change sign. So, okay, that's one thing, and it's what that diagram illustrates. The other thing that one can investigate by looking at rotations of position angle is the Faraday rotation in the intervening, or even within the source, ionized thermal plasma. And that goes as lambda to the squared. And one of the important things about both these mechanisms is that in the optical, the position angle is unaffected by both of them. So that's one of the good parts about comparing the radio and the optical. We can use the optical as an indication of the actual B field. Okay, it's probably too much on this slide. Anyhow, so what we did, we gathered electric vector position angle data from 1964 to 93, and to get a long time baseline. One of the disadvantages is that sometimes it's rather sparsely sampled, but that makes up for, looking at the radio polarization partly makes up for that. So the radio data are from the University of Michigan Radio Astronomy Observatory. Margot and Hugh Aller kindly let me use some of their polarization data. So I'm using their polarization position angles. Let's see. And another thing that I did, because it's an obvious thing when you're looking at polarization vectors, is to compare it with the structure of the jet, the direction of the jet. And so I thought the best thing was to try and get the jet position angle as close to the center of the object as I could. And so I used VLBI databases and information from the literature. That's a huge job. I may never have done this project if I'd realized how huge that was going to be. But anyhow, I obtained the angles on parsec scales over a period of time. So I had a time series of position angles of the inner jet. And I compared that also with the kiloparsec scale. One thing I'm not really going to talk about, but that you can use the data for, is a comparison of the parsec scale and the kiloparsec scale angles of the jets, because Pearson and Rehead had a paper suggesting that maybe 90 degree differences were important, and they had a clever idea for how to explain that. I'm not going to talk about that anymore, but that's another issue. Another part of the project is how to classify these objects. How do you, and either you can do it by maybe radiative efficiency, whether you've got a radiatively efficient disk or whether you don't see the disk, or broad lines or no broad lines. That's one way of classifying them. And another but independent way of classifying them is simply by the usual FR1, FR2 classification, jet morphology, and the radioluminosity. Actually, it should be radiokinetic luminosity or something, but I'm just being simple about it. Okay, the sample ended up being about 160 blazars with observations ranging from one optical polarization measurement to many, many, many. And, and also, not all of the optical polarization quasars have the radio polarization, but most of them do. Okay, I'm going to show you a bunch of polarization angle light curves. So I want some help interpreting these. So I'm going to say some things that are kind of simple-minded, because what we're doing is looking at these objects with a huge beam. The University of Michigan telescope is, what, 85 meters? I can't remember. Maybe it's 30 meters and 85 feet. I can't remember. But anyway, it's got a big beam. It's not like VLBI. And so there are some complications in interpretation from that, but I'm going to ignore them. I'm going to assume that we're looking at the same region, more or less, in the optical and the radio. And I'd like to have some criticism of that, too. Okay, so here we have, this is the way I'm plotting them. It ranges from, on the left, from about 1970 to about 1990 on the right-hand end of this particular plot. This is OJ287, and this is what the position angle light curve looks like at about 4.8 gigahertz. I'm going to overlay this with the higher frequency data so you can compare it. Another thing I should point out, I've marked 1,000 days there, about 3 years, so that's the time scale there. And another thing, the black bars on the right hand of the plots indicate 90 degrees. And one thing, as you go through this, you can see how important 90-degree changes are. At least I think the data show that. Okay, so having described the plots, that's the 8 gigahertz data, so we're getting to higher frequencies. I go from like pink for low frequencies and blue for the highest frequencies, so it's easy to remember which way I'm going. And you can see in this particular object, very well behaved in Faraday rotation, because the polarization angles at different frequencies line up very well. There's the 14.5 gigahertz data. So it's really quite pretty. I think you can see a tendency for there to be kind of positions where the data like to be at either ends of that 90-degree bar there, so 90-degree rotations. Okay, this shows, I'm a bit optical chauvinistic. I made the optical points in red so they were very clear, because that's more my data, and other people's, but still. Okay, and you can see that the scatter increases as you go to higher frequencies. You can actually see that in the radio as well. And there's also a tendency, and I'm not going to necessarily suggest that individual points are significant, but but there's points like here, which is about 90 degrees from down here. This is about 90 degrees from here. This is about 90 degrees from up here. So I know there's a lot of scatter, but I think there's a tendency there, and we'll look at that statistically later. Okay, in general, I have ignored the percentage polarization. I've ignored the flux density, but for interest, I just showed the flux density curve at the top. The information's available from the University of Michigan. It seemed like too big a project to try and interpret everything at once. Okay, same object. Let's see, just keep on going. Okay, another thing, this is the position angle data. And I've coded it in different colors I did that because at different frequencies, the resolution of the VLBI observations are different. And so I was able to tell which was higher resolution data than the rest of it. Seemed like the easiest way to do it. And the yellow is 43 gigahertz data. And those measurements, the measurements on the right are actually from, I think they're from Matt Lister, who looked at variability of the jet position angles. So this is one of the more extreme objects like this. Okay, let's go back and compare that with the optical polarization position angles. Uh-oh. Huh. I don't know what that means. Well, it doesn't matter. I guess it was blank, so... Sorry?
You could get out of presentation mode.
No, it's okay. It's not important. On this one, I've got one of the VLBI maps, and you can see a typical position angle for OJ287, that red-brown arrow on the right. Okay, that doesn't have any other information except that. Okay, I'm going to show you some other sources now, and some of them are BL-lac objects, and some are quasar blazars, or flat spectrum radio quasars. And this shows the kind of behavior that we see for a few sources. So there are different classes of polarization angle variability, and the pink is the low frequency radio, and the blue is the high frequency, and the red is the optical. And you can see the optical is pretty much along the jet direction, from the red arrow at the top, and the low frequency radio is pretty much at the bottom of the 90-degree bar. And the intermediate frequencies are scattered between pretty much. I'd like to interpret that as maybe different optical, a simple-minded interpretation would be different optical depths, and so that the optical depths of the pink would be from high optical synchrotron depth, and the blue and the green would be intermediate optical depths, and maybe the optical depths can vary, and that's why we see a lot of scatter. Again, this is just assuming a single origin for the emission. Okay, more. This is pretty similar, actually. But this is interesting because it's a BL-lac object, but it's quite, for a BL-lac object, it's fairly core dominant, and I don't know whether the more more lobe dominant is what I meant. That only shows the VLBI part, but on larger scales you can see the lobes more clearly, and maybe there's a correlation between the kind of radio structure and seeing this kind of polarization pattern. Okay, let's keep on going, because even though I know I have more time than I thought, I won't bore you too much. Okay, here's another kind of pattern. It's a BL-lac object, and you might see some of your favorite objects go by. I'm happy to share data with you if you're interested. Okay, so we have the significance again of the 90-degree. You can see the 90-degree jump between from past to recent times, and how that relates to the jet position angle. What else? Here's something a little bit different, in that, okay, I should explain that with polarization, the 0 degrees is the same as 180 degrees. So there's a 180-degree ambiguity in the polarization position angle. And so what you see down there at 0 degrees could equally well be plotted above the 180 degrees at the top. And again, I don't see, I can see that the jet seems to align with the optical electric vector polarization position angle, but the other points don't. I think there might be a bit of Faraday. I think this is an old slide, and I didn't apply galactic Faraday rotation. I have to most of them, but not for this and not for a couple of others. Okay, let's keep on going. Okay, this is a different pattern again, because you see what appears to be a fairly slow long-term trend. And this is over many years. And again, I've plotted this because of the 180-degree ambiguity. You know, the way you can follow these position angles is to plot the data above 180 degrees. So I go from about 200 20 degrees to about 40 degrees down the bottom. And again, you see the significance of the jet position angle. I don't know if I see any. I plotted the brown arrow, the jet direction. I've plotted that 180. Sorry, 180 degrees different from the one down the bottom. I think that's a funny point on the slide. I think something got shifted. But anyway, there's about 180 degrees difference between the two arrows there, and you can see that's looks like how the rotation has gone. Okay, and this is an example of how difficult it is sometimes to work with the optical polarization data, because there aren't very many points here. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. You can see. You can see that there are very few optical points. There's those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's probably all we've got for this source, but it's still useful. And you can see how useful it is to be able to compare that with the lower frequency radio data. Okay. Oh, yeah, I didn't correct this one for Faraday rotation in the galaxy, I'm pretty sure. So you can see the effect, you can see the displaced angles from the low frequency to the high frequency. Hey, but it's a good example of it. But I really shouldn't have shown that. And so this is Bipolar herself. And using the higher frequencies, you can see there's a tendency for the higher frequencies to have a sort of preference for the jet direction. And the optical has a huge scatter around it, but it looks like, you know, it avoids 90 degrees to the jet direction, that's for sure. Okay, keep on going. Another, 3C345. Again, you have pretty good coincidence between the three radio frequencies, but you can see that the optical scatters around a bit, and some of the points look like they're 90 degrees, and some of them look like they're more or less aligned. I don't want to overinterpret this, but I've been looking at these data maybe too much. Okay, and here is 3C454.3. Here's the low frequency radio data with, on top of it, the 8 gigahertz data. I've extended this way back using observations pre-University of Michigan. There's not much data. They were some of the first polarization observations that were made of some of these sources. Okay, and there's the high frequency radio data. So you can see there's, in the next slide, I don't see much of a 90-degree thing there, and I don't know whether something got displaced or whether that just isn't. Okay, here's another object. It's not such a well-known object. It's 20, if you can see it, 22, 21 minus 032, or something like that. 22, 23 minus, it's 3C446. Sorry. Low frequencies, and you can see the gradual decline there. 8 gigahertz, high frequencies, 14 gigahertz, and you can see the kind of characteristic changes that tend to want to be about 90 degrees. 5 minutes? Mm. Oh, can I have longer? Okay. Okay, you can see here the optical scatters around a lot. Okay, I'm going to go through. I thought you'd really like that. It's such a mess. But up the top there, the black parts are the structural position angle directions. And there it doesn't seem to obviously correlate with the polarization position angles. But here's an interesting case, because here looks like a decline in the jet direction, a change in the jet direction that maybe corresponds to this kind of slope in the low frequency radio. And maybe it sort of corresponds to the other changes in the radio as well. I've got some other data like that. No, that's pretty. I'm showing you the real stuff. I'm not just choosing the best. Okay, here's another interesting case. It's 0521 minus 36, you know, has shown broad lines appearing and disappearing. And you can see the structural position angle tends to be along the optical, but the radio data, it tends to be pretty much clumped in an uneventful appearance. So it doesn't change very rapidly with time. And let's see, I'm going to say something else about this guy. Oh, never mind. I'm going to run out of time if I do that. Okay, something similar, except that the optical points are embedded in a couple there. I don't know what that one means, not much. This is the same as that because they're 180 degrees different. So, you know, don't get confused by that. But for this source, it was particularly important to plot from 0 to 360 because I wanted to see the pattern there. Okay. Another source with that kind of characteristic, with the almost constant low frequency stuff, with the intermediate radio frequency scattering around between the optical and the low frequency. Terrible. I'm not even going to stop there, but you can tell there's some weird things, and you have to look at those in a lot more detail than I have time for right now. Okay, what this shows, and then I've tried to look at the results statistically. We have the optical polarization compared with the jet direction here. And the different colors represent different sources. So I put them all on top of each other. The FR2s are on the left side. The FR1s are on the right side. And you can see that in general, whether they're FR1 or FR2, there seems to be a tendency for the EVPA to line up with the jet direction. It's not true for everything, because down the bottom here, I've shown the exceptions, and this actually shows some kind of an avoidance of being lined up. And there are some exceptions for the FR1s as well. Maybe the position angle here is wrong for this one or something. There can be all sorts of problems, but that's how that looks. And the next slide compares the position angles in the optical with the position angles in the radio. So what I've done is take separation, require that the optical and the radio be separated by 2, 3, or 4 days. You don't have to, there's not much difference between the different separations, and so don't worry about it too much. So this is a statistical, this is putting everything together for the, this is putting everything together. That's not it. Yes, it is. No, that's, sorry, back a bit. For all the FR1 sources, but without BLAC, and it's very important, a single source, because BLAC has such a lot of observations, the way I've plotted these, they can really alter the total distribution. And so I've got to analyze these a different way, but that's, but what I've done at the moment is just take the strong sources out and see what's left. And okay, so we've got the high frequency radio data compared with the optical on the left, and the low frequency radio data on the right. And you can see with BLAC in there and without BLAC for the FR1s. You can see it makes a huge difference to the distribution. For the FR2s, well, in general, if you just compare this side with the low frequencies with this side compared with the optical at the high frequencies, you can see that it's a bit messed up at the low frequencies. There's more scatter that results from either some kind of optical depth effect. Okay, so the next one just shows these curves for some individual FR2, well-known FR2 objects. And you see OJ is such a well-behaved source because it seems to have very little Faraday rotation. And you see that these curves look very similar at the two different radio frequencies. And you can see that the alignment, the optical and the radio polarization directions align pretty well. I point out that I'm here plotting between 0 degrees and 180 degrees. And then you can just see the sources, the other sources. You can see that the lower frequencies get kind of messed up because there's spurious, or not spurious, but optical depth rotations. Okay, so that's most of what I have to say, but just a few conclusions or sort of observations from these light curves. I've already mentioned the fact that maybe the optical depth that reaches somewhere between the optical and the lowest frequency radio, depending on the source, a different frequency depending on the source. And so that could explain the observations, but we know we might not be looking at exactly the same region for the same object, just at different frequencies. Okay. You can see that there are light curves of rather different character, and I'd really like to try and connect that with some physical property of the jets, but I haven't done that yet. If somebody has some ideas about that, I'd really like to know. Okay. Don't worry about the next two paragraphs. That's just talking about the VLBR results, where we know that there's some alignment at the base of the components that are near the core, with whether it's a BLAC object or a Blazar quasar. I don't really see that. Not a very clear distinction. Okay, the next. The scatter in the electric vector position angle usually increases from the low frequencies to the high frequencies. So you saw that sometimes at the low frequencies there were pretty steady position angle, and the close relationships between the optical and the radio polarization position angles can rule out in obvious Faraday rotation in many cases. And this is not looking like really on the core, probably. But anyway, so what next? Oh, I just put this in for fun. It's a summary of all the, it's the difference between the optical polarization position angle and the jet direction. And it's trying to put all the sources on one plot that have more than 5 optical observations. So it's just good wallpaper. So that's really all I have to say. So thank you.
All right, thank you.